Hello everyone and welcome to my channel YNR Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Victor's voice echoed down the damp cement walls of the hidden basement, vibrating with a coldness Nikki had never heard before, a controlled rage beneath every syllable, as the flicker of bare light bulbs cast distorted shadows that stretched and clawed upward like skeletal hands desperate for air. And Nick, struggling against the heavy iron restraints cutting into his wrists, felt a terror coil around his heart tighter than the chains binding him when he saw the man he had always believed was unbreakable, his father, standing over Nikki with a resolve that chilled him more deeply than the underground air ever could, because Victor's eyes held no warmth, no trace of the man who used to gently stroke Nikki's cheek or place a protective hand on Nick's shoulder, only a burning obsession that seemed to swallow the remnants of reason. And Nikki, trembling but defiant, whispered his name, her voice barely audible above the buzz of an ancient generator, pleading for him to stop whatever twisted plan was unraveling here. But Victor only stepped closer, his polished shoes splashing through puddles of condensation collecting on the cracked concrete floor, leaning in so his breath brushed against her ear as he murmured words that made Nick's heart plummet, cryptic phrases about betrayal and destiny and family legacies buried beneath lies that needed excavation through fear, claiming that everything he was doing was to protect what's mine, what's always been mine. And Nick strained against restraint so violently blood leaked across rusted metal links while he cried out, voice breaking, begging his father to let Nikki go, insisting no family required chains or threats to stay together. Yet Victor turned his head slowly, expression unreadable, as though assessing whether Nick was an enemy or simply a misguided pawn in a game far more sinister than the business feuds the Newmans had weathered over decades. Nikki's eyes glistened as she tried to read him memories. Flashing, weddings, reconciliations, whispered apologies in darkened hospital rooms, and she reached out with trembling fingers as though touch alone could resurrect the man she knew. But Victor recoiled as if burned, something haunted tightening his jaw before he reached beneath his suit jacket to reveal a small silver key, explaining in a chilling whisper that only one of them would leave the room by choice tonight, that love sometimes demanded sacrifice. And if Nikki could not understand that, then she had already chosen her fate. As the generator rumbled and dust drifted from trembling ceiling pipes, Nick screamed in primal horror when Victor secured the key inside a steel lockbox bolted to the wall, telling them it held the past they kept trying to hide, and to unlock it would require the truth, an admission neither had ever spoken aloud, one that could shatter not only their family but their very sense of identity, because Victor claimed Nikki had been lying for years about something far deeper than addiction or infidelity, something so devastating that even Nick could feel icy dread radiating from her frozen posture. Her breath quickened into painful gasps, and Nick realized she knew exactly what Victor meant, saw it in the way her shoulders curled inward, the way her eyes darted toward the locked box like a secret burial ground resurrected to torment her, and Victor demanded she confess, insisting he'd given her every chance to tell Nick the truth, to tell the world the truth, but she'd chosen deception, chosen to bury the evidence that lay sealed inside that steel vault. Nick's voice cracked as he begged them both to stop, unable to fathom what could justify such monstrous cruelty, yet something in Victor's eyes flickered, not malice but desperation, as though the madness was fueled by fear rather than hatred, and Nick's stomach churned at the thought that maybe his father believed he was saving them, protecting them from some catastrophic revelation. Nikki's knees buckled, chains clattering against the cement pillar anchoring her in place, and she whispered a fractured apology, the single syllable splintering Nick's world as Victor nodded grim satisfaction, telling Nick that the truth had consequences, that the empire Nick was meant to inherit was built on foundation even darker than ruthless business deals, and now everything rested on Nikki's confession, because only by speaking it could she earn the key, could she free them. All from this basement, both literal and symbolic. Nick raged, snarling that whatever secret Victor demanded was irrelevant, that imprisoning their family destroyed everything he claimed to protect, but Victor stepped back, folding his arms across his chest with eerie composure, stating that love without truth was rot, and Nikki had poisoned them for decades. As water dripped rhythmically from rusted pipes, forming echoing splashes that intensified the suffocating silence, Nikki lifted her face, tears carving through grime on her skin, voice trembling as she whispered that the son Victor had raised, the son he'd groomed as legacy, the son now chained only feet away was never meant to sit on that throne, that biologically, Nick was not Victor's child, that a long-buried affair had sown him into existence, and she had hidden it to protect all of them, terrified the truth would destroy their fragile family. Nick felt the ground tilt beneath him, world imploding as Victor stared at Nikki. First with frozen disbelief, then blistering fury, though beneath the rage flickered something else, a grief so profound it fractured his imposing facade. As the light above them flickered, casting their distorted shadows across the basement like twisted reflections of broken pasts, Nick choked out a plea for Victor to release Nikki, promising that no revelation could erase the years of love between them, but Victor turned away, shoulders heavy with crushed illusion, and murmured that blood meant everything, that legacy mattered more than love or forgiveness. Then with trembling fingers, he retrieved the key from the lockbox, not to unlock their chains, but to seal the vault again, declaring the truth would never surface beyond this basement, that secrets were safest underground, buried where they belonged. Nikki screamed in anguish, realizing that confession had doomed them instead of freeing them, and Nick's wrath turned feral as he understood his father would rather erase them than confront betrayal. As Victor ascended the staircase toward the heavy metal door, finality weighing in each echoing footstep, he warned that no one would search for them, that he had planned every contingency, and Nick's desperate screams for mercy were swallowed by the mechanical thunk of the door sliding shut, plunging the basement into suffocating darkness where the cold truth settled between mother and son like a living ghost, binding them more tightly than chains ever could. The darkness swallowed mother and son so completely that for a heartbeat Nick wondered if consciousness had slipped into nightmare, if his mind had fractured under the strain of betrayal and captivity. But the cold concrete biting into his knees and the rattle of chains around Nikki's trembling wrists anchored him in the horrifying reality Victor had left them in. Silence pressed against them like a suffocating weight until Nikki's choked sob shattered it, echoing off steel and cement with a rawness that pierced Nick deeper than the revelation itself. And he dragged himself toward her as far as the restraints would allow, whispering reassurances he barely believed, telling her they would escape, that Victor wouldn't really allow them to die down here. Though each word tasted like a lie because deep in his heart Nick knew the man who'd closed the door above them wasn't the father who had once cradled him during fevers or taught him to walk or cheered his first little league game. He had descended into something darker, consumed by obsession with legacy and bloodlines that twisted paternal love into possession. And Nikki, reaching out blindly, grasped Nick's fingers with desperate strength as she apologized over and over, repeating through broken gasps that she had tried to protect him, protect their family, that she'd believed the truth would destroy Victor and Nick both, never imagining that the concealment would instead ignite the present nightmare. Nick squeezed her hand, voice rough yet unwavering, promising her forgiveness wasn't even a question, that the biology meant nothing, that the man who raised him was his father regardless of DNA. But he faltered when confronting the chilling possibility that Victor did not share that belief, that everything built between them was now tainted in Victor's mind, and Nick felt sudden clarity. If they were going to survive, if any hope remained of reclaiming their lives above ground, they needed to break free before Victor returned to finish what he started. Nikki pushed herself upright, spine straightening with fragile determination despite pain etched into the lines of her face. She insisted there must be a weakness somewhere, a loose bolt or aging pipe or electrical panel they could manipulate, because Victor, for all his power, could not anticipate every variable forever, and they would find a way. Nick, scanning the gloom, spotted the vague outlines of shelves stacked with dusty crates and an old maintenance workstation cluttered with tools, but the length of his chains permitted only a few inches of movement, making the distance feel like a mocking chasm between life and death. He tugged until metal sliced skin and blood dripped warm and sticky, but he welcomed pain. It reminded him he was still alive, still capable of fighting, and Nikki mirrored his resolve, bracing herself against the pillar as she attempted to unwind a bolt anchoring her restraints, but it refused to budge despite trembling fingers clawing at rusted grooves. Minutes stretched into hours marked only by the low hum of the generator and the occasional groan of shifting pipes, and as fatigue gnawed at their bodies, Nick forced himself to analyze the room like a strategist rather than a son drowning in betrayal. Victor's arrogance had always been his weakness, his belief that control was absolute, that his foresight was unmatched, and Nick clung to the thought as he studied lock mechanisms, pipe networks, structural cracks, searching for any overlooked detail. Nikki's breathing grew shallow, and Nick fumbled to comfort her, but she steadied herself, pushing hair from her face with a trembling hand as she whispered that her past sins had finally rotted into consequences she could no longer outrun, that she deserved whatever came. But Nick snapped in defiance, voice echoing fiercely around them as he insisted she didn't deserve suffering, that every human made mistakes born not of malice but fear and love tangled in impossible choices, and he would not allow her to surrender to despair. As the hours bled into each other, Nick's mind replayed Victor's last words. No one would search for them, yet Nick clung to a sliver of hope that someone loyal, someone perceptive, would notice their absence, trace inconsistencies in Victor's story, uncover a trail leading to this subterranean prison. Perhaps Sharon or Victoria, or even Adam, who perpetually danced between betrayal and redemption, would recognize the signs and begin investigating. But hope alone would not free them, and Nick resolved to act rather than wait. The faint glow from the single light bulb hanging overhead flickered sporadically like a heartbeat struggling to continue, and Nick realized the generator powering the room was old, unstable. Perhaps a surge or overload could knock out electricity, potentially triggering security failsafes or weakening electronic locks. He shifted, straining his chains to reach a length of frayed wiring snaking across the wall near him, sparks flashing whenever it brushed exposed metal. If he could yank it free cause a controlled short, it might disable restraints or at least alert someone topside. Nikki, reading his intention, nodded slowly, fear and hope warring in her eyes, and she urged him to be careful, voice quivering as she acknowledged that desperation made danger necessary. Nick inhaled deeply, steeling himself before lunging toward the wiring with every ounce of strength, fingertips grazing insulation, then gripping tight. With a guttural roar he yanked, sparks exploding outward as electricity surged violently through the circuit, plunging the room into darkness as the generator sputtered into silence. For a heartbeat there was absolute blackness and eerie quiet, and then faint emergency lighting flickered, bathing the basement in dim red glow that pulsed like blood through veins. But then, an unexpected mechanical whir echoed above them, and metal clamps securing Nick's chains disengaged with a sharp snap as fail-safe protocols automatically released restraints during emergency shutdowns. Nick collapsed forward, wrists raw and bleeding, overwhelmed by shock and relief. He scrambled to Nikki, working frantically to release her bonds before power restored and the fail-safes re-engaged. Nikki trembled violently, murmuring gratitude through tears as Nick supported her weakened body, determined to shield her until they escaped. They limped together toward the stairwell door that Victor had locked behind him, but the keypad beside it glowed dark, unpowered, locking them inside unless manual override existed. Nick scanned the walls, noticing a recessed panel near the ground, likely an emergency mechanical release. With trembling fingers he pried cover loose using a rusted screwdriver from the workstation, revealing gears and levers crusted with grime. He and Nikki worked together, straining muscles and joints, and after agonizing minutes a metallic clang signaled success as the door creaked ajar. Nick pushed it open cautiously, every creak amplifying fear that Victor might hear above ground, but silence greeted them. The stairway spiraled upward through claustrophobic concrete walls, illuminated only by emergency lights that blinked intermittently. Nikki stumbled, weakened from shock and dehydration, and Nick slipped his arm around her torso, guiding her step by step until they reached the top landing where another steel door loomed. Nick's pulse pounded in his ears, dread rising. What if Victor waited beyond, expecting escape? Gathering courage, he pressed the handle slowly. To his surprise, the door swung open into a dim hallway where shadows stretched across tiled floors and ventilation ducts hummed faintly. Nikki gasped softly, leaning heavily against Nick as they navigated toward a faint glow at hall's end, senses alert for alarms or guards, but none came. A maintenance access corridor branched off to the right, and Nick recognized it as part of the Newman Tower basement. Victor hadn't taken them to some remote secret compound. They had been beneath the family empire all along, hidden in plain sight under corporate foundations built on power and secrecy. Nick led Nikki toward an elevator recessed in the corridor, but its display blinked error messages, likely offline due to generator overload. Instead, they followed emergency exit signs toward a concrete stairwell, ascending countless flights toward street level. Each step strained Nikki's strength, and Nick encouraged her gently, whispering affirmations until finally they reached ground-level exit door. Nick paused, listening for footsteps or voices, heart racing as he slowly opened door to deserted lobby shimmering with reflections from polished marble floors and silent monitors displaying security feeds looping static. The building was eerily empty at this hour, most employees gone, and Victor nowhere in sight. Taking chance, Nick guided Nikki across lobby toward phone on reception desk, His trembling fingers dialed emergency services, voice hoarse as he demanded immediate police response to basement kidnapping at Newman Enterprises. But before he completed sentence, the line cut abruptly, screen flashing, call blocked. And a cold realization stabbed his gut. Victor still controlled the building's communications. Suddenly, loudspeakers crackled overhead, and Victor's voice boomed into lobby with chilling calm, congratulating Nick on ingenuity, remarking that only a true Newman could manipulate his system so cleverly, proving perhaps bloodlines weren't everything. His tone darkened, warning that escape from basement did not equate escape from truth or consequences, and if they stepped outside before hearing him out, everything they cherished would crumble publicly. Nikki collapsed into sobs, overwhelmed by exhaustion and dread, and Nick clenched jaw, furious at manipulation but terrified of repercussions Victor implied. The lobby lights dimmed as Victor instructed them to return to conference room 3 floors above, promising explanation and negotiation of terms to conclude ordeal. Refusal, he warned, would trigger irreversible exposure of Nikki's confession to press, detonating scandal that would destroy reputations and legacy permanently. Nick looked at Nikki's devastated expression, understanding that public humiliation could break her completely, fuel relapse disasters, and ripple into family implosion. Torn between fury and duty, Nick made agonizing decision. They would confront Victor but on their own terms, no longer captives but negotiators demanding accountability. He whispered reassurance to Nikki, promising he would protect her no matter what, and guided her to stairwell leading upward. Each step felt heavier than ascent from basement because psychological prison remained, chains of family loyalty and trauma unbroken. On the designated floor, they followed flickering lights to conference room. Victor stood inside alone, back toward them, silhouetted against windows overlooking city lights shimmering across darkness. He turned slowly, expression carved from stone yet eyes haunted. Nick positioned himself defensively before Nikki, demanding Victor surrender control, accept responsibility for monstrosity committed in basement. Victor raised hands slowly, insisting everything he did was motivated by love twisted by betrayal, that discovering truth of Nick's paternity ruptured his reality, triggering desperate attempt to reclaim certainty and legacy, and he begged Nikki to understand he acted from heartbreak, not malice. Nick exploded with rage, roaring that love didn't justify kidnapping, chaining family underground, threatening ruin, and he vowed to report crimes unless Victor surrendered and sought treatment for psychotic break. Victor sagged visibly, exhaustion cracking mask of control, and he whispered that empire he built meant nothing compared to family. Admitting chain of abuse, he perpetuated through obsession with bloodline-reflected scars from his own father's cruelty. Tears shimmered in Nikki's eyes as she approached him cautiously, sharing painful truth that she concealed affair decades ago because she feared Victor's reaction then, and now proved her fear justified. Her confession and Victor's descent had roots in generational trauma poisoning love until it mutated into dominance. Nick, though seething, recognized fragment of humanity resurfacing in Victor, his remorse genuine beneath delusion, and he proposed compromise. Victor would voluntarily commit to psychiatric evaluation, relinquish corporate control temporarily to prevent further damage, and safeguard Nikki's secret until family decided appropriate time to address together truthfully. Victor trembled, war raging in his eyes as ego clashed with vulnerability, but finally he nodded with defeated resignation, accepting conditions. Police sirens wailed faintly outside building. Someone must have detected emergency generator shutdown and dispatched responders, and Nick exhaled shakily, knowing consequences awaited but grateful they would face them together above ground rather than entombed alive. Moments later, officers burst into lobby, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Nick stepped forward, hands raised, explaining calmly they were safe now and Victor required medical evaluation, not violence. Nikki leaned into Nick for support as paramedics guided Victor gently toward stretcher, his expression distant, haunted but no longer raging. As authorities escorted him away, Victor paused, turning to Nick and Nikki with a broken whisper that despite everything, love remained beneath wreckage, and he prayed someday they might forgive. Nick wrapped Nikki in his arms, feeling first rays of dawn filtering through lobby skylights, illuminating shards of shattered illusions, but also possibility of rebuilding with truth rather than secrets. They stepped outside into crisp morning air, free yet burdened, knowing healing ahead required confronting painful realities, dismantling toxic legacies, rebuilding fractured trust. But as sun rose over city skyline warming their chilled skin, Nick vowed silently to break cycle of inherited trauma, to choose compassion over control, honesty over fear, forging family not through blood but unconditional love, and beneath weight of nightmarish ordeal, flicker of hope ignited within heart scarred but still beating, ready to begin again above ground where secrets could finally breathe and dissolve under healing light.